The trail was empty, that much was certain. Elena Vasquez had checked the register at the trailhead, scanned the parking lot, watched the last car pull out before she even started lacing her boots. It was early October in the northern Rockies, that narrow slice of autumn where the aspen groves explode into gold and the crowds of summer have already retreated to warmer ambitions. She had planned this trip for 8 months, a solo traverse of a route that cut deep into designated wilderness, climbing through subalpine meadows, skirting the edges of 2 glacial lakes, and eventually crossing a high ridge before dropping into the valley on the far side. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turned. She had done harder things. She told herself that, shouldered her pack, and walked into the trees. If you have ever wanted to understand what it means to be truly alone in wild country, to feel the weight of silence pressing in from all directions, while something ancient watches from the tree line, stay with this. Because what happened to Elena over the next 18 hours changed the way she understood wilderness, predators, and herself. And if you want more stories like this one, stories pulled from the edge of what people survive and how they survive it, subscribe now. We go deep into the places where the natural world stops being a backdrop and starts being the whole story. The first hours were everything she had hoped for. The trail wound through old-growth Douglas fir, the kind of forest that feels genuinely primeval, where the canopy closes overhead like a cathedral ceiling, and the only sound is the soft percussion of your own footsteps on packed earth. Elena was experienced enough to move quietly, not the performative quiet of someone trying to prove something, but the natural quiet of a person who had spent enough time outdoors to understand that noise was a kind of arrogance. She had been hiking seriously since her early 20s, first in the Appalachians, then the Cascades, then progressively farther and more remote as her skills and her appetite for solitude grew. She was 34 now. She knew how to read weather and water and terrain. She knew the difference between a bear track and an elk track and could estimate the age of both. She was not naive about wilderness. That matters, because what happened to her was not the result of carelessness or ignorance. It was simply what happens when you enter a world governed by entirely different rules. She made her first camp at the edge of a high meadow, just below the tree line, set up her tent in the last hour of daylight, cooked a simple meal, and sat outside long enough to watch the sky go fully dark. The stars in that part of the Rockies on a moonless October night are so dense they seem structural, like the sky is held up by light. She noted the temperature dropping faster than she had expected, pulled on her insulated layer, and went to bed around 9. She slept well. She almost always slept well in the backcountry. She woke before dawn without an alarm, which was her habit. She broke camp efficiently, ate a cold breakfast while the sky went from black to deep blue, to the particular shade of pale orange that happens in high country just before direct sunlight hits. She was on the trail before 7. The second day was supposed to take her up over the ridge and down to the second lake, where she planned to camp before the final push-out. The elevation gain was significant but manageable. She had done the math on it weeks earlier. Her legs were fresh and the air was cold and clean, and she felt genuinely, completely good. She noticed the first wolf track at approximately 9:30 in the morning. She almost missed it. She was moving at a solid pace, and the track was in soft earth at the edge of the trail, where a small drainage crossed, the soil darkened by seeping groundwater. She stopped because something in her peripheral vision snagged, that almost involuntary attention that experienced hikers develop for things that are slightly out of place. She crouched down and looked at it properly. It was large, considerably larger than any domestic dog track she had ever seen, and she had seen plenty of both. The shape was right, the 4 toe pads arranged forward of the main pad, the claw marks present, but not deeply gouged in the way a bear's would be. The gait pattern in the soft earth suggested a single animal moving at a relaxed pace, not running, not bounding, walking. She took a photograph and stood up and looked around. The trees were close on both sides here. The drainage was barely a trickle. She could not hear anything except wind moving through the upper canopy. She was not frightened. This is important to understand about Elena, and about people who spend real time in wild country generally. The presence of a wolf track was not, in itself, alarming. Wolves had been reintroduced to this region and were doing what wolves do, which is moving vast distances across the landscape in pursuit of the elk and deer that were their primary prey at this time of year. A single track on a trail was evidence of the world working correctly. It was, in fact, one of the things she had hoped to see some evidence of during this trip, having read that this particular wilderness area had a small but established pack. She stood and looked at the track for another moment, noted the direction of travel, which was the same as hers, and continued on. She found the second track 40 minutes later, then a third shortly after that. The animal, or animals, had been using this trail corridor as a travel route, which made complete sense. Wolves are pragmatic about energy expenditure. A maintained trail through dense forest is easier to move along than crashing through the undergrowth. She was, in effect, following the same logic they were. For a while this felt companionable in a distant, intellectual way. She was sharing infrastructure with apex predators. There was something satisfying about that. The trail steepened as she climbed toward the ridge. The forest thinned and the sky opened up. She stopped at a rocky viewpoint to drink water and eat a handful of trail mix, and it was there, scanning the slope below her more out of habit than expectation, that she saw them. Two shapes at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 300 meters downslope. She raised her binoculars. Wolves, large ones, with the characteristic blocky heads and deep chests of mature animals. Gray and black coats, difficult to distinguish individually against the mottled background of rock and autumn vegetation. They were standing still, oriented upslope, oriented toward her. She watched them, they watched her. This lasted perhaps 20 seconds before both animals turned and vanished back into the trees with that liquid, effortless movement that large predators have, as if they are made of something slightly different from the rest of the physical world, subject to fewer of its constraints. She lowered the binoculars. Her heart was elevated, she noticed. Not hammering, just up. She was aware of the quality of the silence around her, and the fact that she was the only human in a very large area of ground. She had her bear spray on her hip. She checked it by feel without looking, an unconscious gesture. She ate the rest of her trail mix, drank more water, and continued up toward the ridge. Wolves are among the most studied large predators on Earth, and what research consistently shows is that healthy wild wolves almost never attack adult humans. The documented cases of predatory wolf attacks on people in North America are extraordinarily rare, far rarer than attacks by bears, mountain lions, or even moose. What wolves do, in documented encounters with humans in wilderness settings, is watch. They observe. They follow at a distance. Sometimes they parallel a trail for miles. The leading hypothesis among researchers who study this behavior is that wolves are gathering information. They are extraordinarily intelligent social animals who assess novel situations thoroughly before committing to any response. A lone human moving through their territory is a novel situation, so they watch. Elena knew this. She had read widely on wolf behavior after their reintroduction became a significant ecological and political story in the region. She knew the statistics. She knew the theory. But there is a categorical difference between knowing something intellectually and standing on a mountain trail in October, alone, with the certain knowledge that wolves are somewhere in the trees around you, watching. The knowledge does not dissolve the feeling. It shapes it, channels it, prevents it from becoming panic. But the feeling is still there, and it is very old and very physical, seated somewhere deep in the body below the level of rational thought. She crested the ridge just before noon. The view opened in all directions, the kind of panoramic sweep that makes the effort of climbing feel immediately worthwhile. She could see for 40 or 50 miles in every direction on a clear day, and this was a clear day. Behind her, the valley she had come up from, its drainage patterns visible as darker lines of vegetation against the pale grass and rock. Ahead and below, the second lake, dark blue and still, surrounded by a narrow band of conifers before the valley opened up. She stopped to eat lunch at the top, sitting on a flat rock that was warmed by the sun, with her back against a larger boulder so nothing could approach her from behind. An old habit. She scanned the slopes methodically while she ate. She did not see the wolves again, but she was aware of the ridge's exposure in a way she would not have been the previous day. There was nowhere to hide up here, and nothing to climb, and visibility in all directions was both a comfort and a reminder of how small she was in this landscape. She descended the far side of the ridge into the trees. The trail here was less used, the tread softer and less defined in places, threading through dense stands of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The light filtered down in broken columns. The temperature dropped noticeably as she lost elevation and the canopy closed in. She was perhaps a mile below the ridge when she heard it, a sound that is almost impossible to adequately describe to someone who has never heard it in the wild, in the actual wild, not a recording or a zoo. A wolf howl, close, somewhere in the trees to her right, on the uphill side of the trail. Then, a few seconds later, an answer from behind her, higher on the ridge she had just crossed. 2 animals at minimum, possibly 3. She stopped walking. She stood completely still and listened. The howls faded. Silence reclaimed the forest. Her breathing, she noticed, was shallow. She deliberately drew a slow, deep breath, held it, released it. She was fine. She was going to be fine. She checked the time. It was early afternoon. She had 3 or 4 hours of daylight left. The second lake was perhaps 2.5 miles ahead. She would make it well before dark. She started walking again, faster than before, not running, but with purpose. The thing about moving faster is that it can be both a rational response and an emotional one, and distinguishing between them in the moment is harder than it sounds. A faster pace was reasonable given the time and distance calculations. It was also her body's response to an ambient sense of threat that her rational mind kept evaluating and setting aside. She moved quickly through the trees, checking her map at trail junctions, keeping her pace steady on the downhill gradient. The trail was good here, clear and easy to follow. She had both trekking poles out and was using them properly, shifting weight and maintaining balance on the steeper sections. Everything was technically fine. She saw the wolf for the first time at close range, about 40 minutes below the ridge. It was simply there, standing in the trail ahead of her, perhaps 60 feet away. She stopped instantly. The wolf did not move. It was looking directly at her with that characteristic wolf gaze, utterly unreadable by human standards. It was large, a male, she thought, based on the size, though she was not certain. Its coat was predominantly gray, with darker markings along the back, and it was in prime autumn condition, well-fed and clearly healthy. It stood squarely in the trail, with a complete absence of any of the submissive or fearful behaviors you might see in a domestic dog confronted by a stranger. It was simply looking at her, assessing. She did what every available piece of guidance on wolf encounters recommends. She stood her ground. She did not run, because running from a wolf triggers pursuit instinct as surely as running from any predator. She made herself as large as she could, raising her trekking poles and drawing herself up to full height. She spoke to it in a steady, firm voice, not shouting, not screaming, but speaking with authority, the way you are advised to speak to aggressive dogs. She told it to go. She said it clearly and repeatedly. She maintained eye contact. The wolf listened to her speak for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 15 seconds. Then it turned, without haste, without any suggestion of having been driven away, and stepped off the trail into the trees and disappeared. She waited. She counted to 60. She moved forward slowly, watching the tree line on both sides, and she did not stop watching it for the next hour. Wolves communicate in ways that researchers are still working to fully understand. The sophistication of their social structure, built around a breeding pair and their offspring across multiple generations, requires a corresponding sophistication in communication. They use howls, which can convey individual identity, location, emotional state, and intent across miles of terrain. They use body language with a nuance that rivals primates. They use scent marking to convey information that persists long after the animal has moved on. And they use what researchers describe as coordinated movement, a kind of distributed awareness across the group, where individuals position themselves in relation to a subject of interest in ways that suggest shared information processing. What Elena was experiencing, though she could not have known the full extent of it at the time, was the focused attention of a group of highly intelligent social predators who had made her the subject of exactly this kind of distributed observation. The second lake appeared through the trees just before 3 in the afternoon, its surface glittering in the low autumn sun. She felt a release of tension at the sight of it, an almost physical easing across her shoulders that she had not fully registered carrying. She found a good campsite on the eastern shore, sheltered by a small stand of spruce, with a clear view across the water and a fire ring left by previous campers. She set up her tent, hung her food on the bear cable strung between 2 trees at the edge of the clearing, and built a small fire as the light began to fade. Fire is a comfort in situations like this on a level that has nothing to do with warmth. It is ancient. It is specifically ancient in the context of predators. Sitting by a fire in wild country with predators nearby is sitting in a posture that human beings have been sitting in for longer than we have been fully anatomically modern. The body knows what the fire means. She ate and sat and watched the lake go dark. She heard nothing. No howls. No movement in the trees. An owl called somewhere up on the slope above her, its call descending through the cold air cleanly. Stars appeared. She banked the fire and got into her tent and lay on her back in her sleeping bag and stared at the tent ceiling and conducted a systematic review of the day. She was not in danger. She was almost certain she was not in danger. The wolves had had multiple opportunities to close the distance and had not done so. The encounter on the trail had been an assessment, not an approach. She had done the right things. She was camped safely. Tomorrow she would make the final 6 miles out to the trailhead and drive home and take a hot shower, and this would be a story she told for the rest of her life. She slept, and then she woke up. She did not know what woke her. There was no sound she could identify. It was very dark, the fire long reduced to coals, the starlight insufficient to illuminate anything inside the tent. She lay still and listened, with the particular quality of attention that cuts through sleep immediately in certain situations, that ancient circuit that operates below consciousness and delivers a person from deep sleep to high alert in a fraction of a second. She heard nothing. Then she heard something, a sound at the edge of perception, directional, coming from somewhere near the food hang. Not the gross mechanical crashing of a bear working at a food bag, but something much quieter. Movement. The soft compression of leaf litter under a careful foot. She unzipped her sleeping bag with agonizing slowness, working the zipper 1 millimeter at a time to suppress the sound. She had her headlamp and her bear spray in her hands before she was fully sitting up, equipment positioned in her sleeping bag beside her the previous night, specifically because of the day's events. She put her boots on inside the tent. She listened. The sound had stopped. She unzipped the tent door, slowly, and pushed it open and turned on the headlamp. 3 pairs of eyes reflected the beam back at her from the edge of the camp. They were on 3 sides of her, not the food hang, not the fire ring. The edge of the campsite itself, in a rough semicircle, perhaps 20 feet out. She swept the beam around and counted the eyes, matching them to bodies as her vision adjusted. 3 wolves, possibly 4, actually sitting, in the posture of animals who had arranged themselves deliberately and settled in. Not the crouched, tense stillness of a predator about to rush, something more like the patient, organized attention of animals that had concluded this was worth staying near. She got out of the tent. She stood up. She made herself as large as possible. She activated the torch to its full brightness and swept it around the perimeter of the camp. The wolves blinked in the light but did not move. She yelled, a real yell this time, full volume, sharp and authoritative. Hands up, poles raised, everything she had. 1 wolf shifted its weight. That was all. She yelled again. She banged her trekking poles together. She grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack and threw it toward the nearest set of eyes, not at the animal, but near it. The wolf stood up, looked at her, and sat back down. This is the point in an account like this where the word fear begins to fall short of the actual experience. Elena has described this moment in subsequent interviews as the point at which she understood, at the level of the body rather than the mind, that she was being evaluated by something that had already decided how it felt about her efforts to drive it away. The wolves were not afraid of her yelling. They were not confused by it. They appeared to be receiving it as information, processing it, and continuing to hold their position, because whatever they were doing here was not disrupted by her behavior. She was, in the most precise sense, subject to their attention rather than in control of the encounter. She kept the fire going. She put on every layer of clothing she had. She did not go back into the tent. She sat by the fire with her bear spray in her hand and faced outward and kept the fire bright and watched the perimeter of the camp until a pale gray light began to separate the sky from the mountains. She heard the wolves moving in the trees around her camp throughout the night. Not constantly, but periodically, the sound of something large navigating through undergrowth. A few times she heard what might have been a low vocalization, not a howl, something much quieter, more local. At some point before dawn, she heard something she could not identify at all, a sound she has struggled to describe to anyone since, which she characterizes as a kind of directed quiet, an absence of sound that felt intentional and pressurized and very close. The wolves were still there at first light. She could see them now in the growing illumination, 2 of them visible at the edge of the tree line, sitting in the same patient way they had been sitting most of the night. She broke camp with every movement calculated and deliberate. No sudden gestures, no running to fetch anything, everything done steadily and with her weight always facing outward. She ate nothing. There was no time and no appetite. She packed her tent, shouldered her bag, retrieved her food bag from the hang. The wolves watched all of this with what appeared to be professional interest. She started down the trail, and they followed her. Not at distance, not as shadows glimpsed in peripheral vision. They followed her at between 40 and 80 feet, visible in the trail behind her, moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped, to check the map or adjust her pack, or simply to turn and look at them. When she turned and faced them and yelled and raised her poles, they stopped, they waited. When she turned back and continued walking, they continued too. A third wolf joined from the trees to her left about a mile out of camp, then a fourth. Over the next 3 miles, she was accompanied by what she eventually calculated was a group of 5 animals, moving in a loose formation behind and to the sides of her, present enough that she was never not aware of them, far enough that the word following is the only accurate one. She has thought and talked extensively about what she felt during those 3 miles. Terror is not the word she uses, though she acknowledges it was present. What she describes is something more complex, a layered experience, in which genuine fear and genuine awe were operating simultaneously, in a way that was almost impossible to separate. These animals were magnificent. She knew this even in the worst moments of the previous night and this morning. She was watching, at close range, the coordinated behavior of a healthy wild wolf pack. This was something the vast majority of people who have ever wanted to see wolves in the wild will never experience at this proximity. The fact that it was also frightening did not make it any less extraordinary. It made it more so. Beauty and threat are not opposites in the natural world. Frequently, they are the same thing. The trail crossed a meadow about a mile from the trailhead, and it was here that the wolves stopped following her. She reached the far edge of the meadow where the trees began again, turned around, and they were at the near edge, stationary. Watching her cross the last open ground, she stopped at the tree line and looked back at them. 5 animals, spread across 50 feet of meadow edge, backlit by the morning sun. It was, she says, one of the most arresting images she has ever stood in front of. She stood and looked at them for almost a full minute. Then she turned and walked into the trees and completed the last mile to the trailhead without hearing or seeing them again. When she reached her car, she sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before she felt ready to drive. Wolves returned to the northern Rocky Mountain states through a combination of natural recolonization from Canada and a formal reintroduction program that placed animals from Canadian packs into Yellowstone and central Idaho in 1995 and 1996. The results of that reintroduction represent one of the most significant and instructive ecological restoration events of the past century. What happened in Yellowstone in the years after wolves returned has become a foundational case study in what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a sequence of effects that ripples through an ecosystem from the top of the food chain downward. Before wolves, elk in Yellowstone grazed without pressure in river valleys and riparian areas, the moist, vegetated zones along waterways. They could stand in stream beds and eat willows and aspens and cottonwoods for as long as they chose, because nothing was going to challenge them. The result was severely degraded riparian vegetation, which affected songbird diversity, beaver populations, water temperature, stream bank stability, and a cascade of other biological relationships that extended far beyond the elk themselves. After wolves returned, elk behavior changed before elk numbers did. The animals became what ecologists call risk-sensitive foragers. They still ate. They just stopped standing in stream valleys for hours at a time, because doing so made them vulnerable. They moved more. They used open areas differently. And the vegetation in the riparian zones began to recover with remarkable speed, which brought back the beavers, which changed the hydrology of the streams themselves, which affected the fish, which affected the birds, which altered the physical landscape in ways visible from satellite imagery. The wolves had changed the rivers. Not by being at the rivers, by making elk afraid of being at the rivers. The fear of predators, it turns out, is an ecological force in its own right. This is the context in which Elena's experience makes complete ecological sense, even if it made no personal sense whatsoever in the moment. The pack she encountered were animals operating within a perfectly normal behavioral range. The following behavior, the overnight camp observation, the coordinated positioning, all of it is documented in research on wolf behavior in areas where the animals have limited contact with humans. These wolves had probably never been close to a human alone in their territory before. They were doing what the most successful predators do, gathering information, assessing risk, and making decisions based on what they learned. They were not hunting her. They were learning her. The biology of the wolf is tuned to exactly this kind of sustained, patient intelligence. Their hunting success rate when pursuing large prey is considerably lower than most people assume, often somewhere between 15 and 20%, even for experienced packs, chasing animals they have evolved alongside for thousands of generations. This means that every energy expenditure must be calibrated against likely return. Attacking a healthy adult human, an unfamiliar animal of ambiguous capability, presents an unknown risk-reward calculation. Unknown risk, with wolves, tends to produce caution, not aggression. They choose to watch first. They have the patience for it. A wolf pack that has run down a full-grown bull elk in knee-deep snow has absolutely no need to rush any decision. They can afford to take the time to learn something new. What the pack was doing with Elena was learning something new. And she, by doing the right things, by not running, by making herself a coherent and assertive presence rather than a panicked and fleeing one, was providing them with information that consistently resolved the risk-reward calculation against aggression. Every time she turned and faced them, she was communicating, "This thing is aware of us and will not make itself easy." Every time she maintained her pace down the trail rather than running, she was communicating, "This thing is not a prey animal in distress." Every time she yelled and threw wood near them at the camp, she was communicating, "This thing has responses we need to account for." The wolves were rational. She was rational. And rationality in the wilderness is sometimes enough. The gray wolf, Canis lupus, is one of the most widely distributed wildland animals that has ever existed. Before human persecution reduced populations across most of their historical range, wolves inhabited every continent except Antarctica and Australia, adapting to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to desert grassland to temperate forest, evolving local variants shaped by the prey available and the conditions present but remaining, across all of this variation, fundamentally the same animal, the same social structure, the same extraordinary intelligence, the same behavioral sophistication. Wolves can recognize individual human faces. Research conducted in Hungary at the Family Dog Project has demonstrated that wolves raised alongside humans develop a capacity for reading human emotional and attentional states that is sophisticated and flexible. They are not domesticated, they are wild, but they are cognitively complex in ways that make the idea of them simply watching a lone human hiker for 18 hours feel less mysterious than it might initially seem. Watching and learning and making assessments is what they do. It is a core competency. It is why they have survived across 10,000 years of systematic human persecution that reduced them to tiny remnant populations in the corners of their former range. Elena filed a detailed report with the relevant land management agency when she reached cellular service. She documented the encounter with the photographs she had taken, the GPS coordinates of the significant interaction points, and a written account that ran to several pages. She was not the first person to report close-range wolf encounters in this particular wilderness area, and she would not be the last. The pack she encountered was assessed to be in good condition and exhibiting normal behavior. The follow response was logged, noted in the literature on human-wolf interactions in areas of limited human presence, and used in subsequent guidance materials prepared for hikers entering the region. She went back the following spring. Different route, same wilderness area. She did not see wolves, but she found tracks on the third morning, at the edge of camp, circling the site. She sat for a long time looking at the tracks. She did not feel afraid. She was not sure exactly what she felt. Something that required a better vocabulary than she had available. Something about being known, in a place where you had expected to be invisible, by something that was absolutely not obligated to notice you at all. Wolves in wild country are not rare because they were never there. They are recovering from being made rare by a sustained campaign that nearly eliminated them from the lower 48 states of America by the middle of the 20th century. A campaign driven by a combination of ranching interests, government bounty programs, and a cultural attitude toward predators that defined them primarily as threats to be eliminated. The irony is that the elimination of wolves produced ecological damage that cost many times more to remediate than the livestock losses that motivated the killing. The absence of predators in a landscape is not a stable condition. It is a slow unraveling, a trophic cascade in reverse, a grassroots to canopy deterioration of the relationships that hold a functional ecosystem together. The return of wolves to places like Yellowstone and the Northern Rockies is not sentiment, it is ecology. It is the restoration of a system to something closer to the conditions under which it evolved and under which it is, empirically, more resilient and more biologically diverse. This matters because Elena's experience on that trail was not an anomaly or an accident. It was a consequence of a recovering population of intelligent predators relearning how to use a landscape, including how to assess the novel and unfamiliar things that move through it. The wolves that followed her down that trail were doing so because they existed, because their population had been given the conditions to recover, because someone decades ago had decided that the ecological logic of large predators in wild landscapes outweighed the discomfort of their presence. The fear Elena felt, real and legitimate and written into her nervous system at a level below language, was the cost of admission to a world that is genuinely wild. Not curated, not managed at a scale that removes real risk, but wild in the full and demanding sense of the word. And she would not have it any other way. She has said this clearly and repeatedly in the time since the encounter. She is a more careful, more attentive, more deeply informed wilderness traveler for what happened. She understands things about wolf behavior that no book could have taught her as effectively as 3 miles of trail with 5 wolves at her back. She understands things about her own nervous system and her own decision-making under sustained pressure that she could not have learned any other way, and she understands, in a way that has become central to how she thinks about wild places, that the absence of genuine risk is not a feature of true wilderness. It is the definition of the absence of wilderness. A landscape from which all real danger has been removed is a park, not a wild place, and parks, however beautiful, cannot do what wild places do. They cannot make you understand your own size. They cannot deliver you to the clear, cold, necessary knowledge of what you actually are in relation to the rest of the living world. She crossed the meadow in the morning light with wolves at her back, and they stopped at the edge of the trees, and she looked at them, and they looked at her, and for a moment, the accounting of who belonged where, and what the natural order of things actually was in that high, clean, cold corner of the Rocky Mountain West was perfectly and precisely clear. And then she walked into the trees and drove home and thought about it for the rest of the year. In the years since reintroduction began, the wolves of the Northern Rockies have expanded their range into areas where they had been absent for half a century or more. They have moved into Oregon and Washington and California and into parts of their historical range in the Great Plains. Every new pack established in new territory is a group of animals encountering unfamiliar things, including human beings, and going through the same process of assessment and information gathering that Elena experienced on that trail. Most of these encounters go unwitnessed and unreported because most of them happen at such a distance that the human involved is not aware of them at all. The wolves watching from a ridge as a day hiker crosses the valley floor below. The pack resting in the shade of a river bend as a kayaker passes on the current. The single animal standing at the edge of a logging road at 2 in the morning, watching the headlights of a truck, gone before the driver can focus. These encounters are happening constantly in recovering wolf country, and they represent the leading edge of a relationship between our species and another being relearned on both sides after a long and violent interruption. Wolves are learning again what humans are, and humans, the lucky ones, the ones who end up on a mountain trail alone in October, with the sudden certain knowledge that they are being watched from the trees, are learning again what wolves are. What it actually means to share a landscape with an animal that is your equal or better in every faculty relevant to survival in that landscape, that has been there longer and knows it more deeply and can move through it more efficiently and can maintain an awareness of it at scales your senses cannot access. What it means to be, for a few miles on an autumn morning, not the apex of anything, but simply another animal using a trail. The encounter changed Elena's sense of what wilderness meant and what it was for. Before that October trip, wilderness was something she moved through. After it, wilderness was something she was in, something she was embedded in, something that had its own awareness of her. This is not a mystical claim. It is a biological one. A healthy wolf pack is a distributed sensory and cognitive system of extraordinary capability, and when that system focuses its attention on you, you are in a relationship with it whether you chose to enter that relationship or not. The trail disappears. The parking lot disappears. The distance between yourself and the living world disappears. And you are left with what has always been true, which is that this world preceded you by an unimaginable margin and will continue long after your particular brief passage through it. And the most honest and clarifying thing you can do, now and then, is go somewhere it can look you in the eye. She carried that with her back to the trailhead, and she carries it still.